we're coming for your toothbrush, a critique of the logical foundations of private property. So section 1, private property versus personal property. So we're going to be examining the nature of properties. Specifically, we're going to address the origins and justifications for private property and examine the historical conditions through which the practice of private property came to be widespread. To begin, we need to first draw a distinction between the types of property. Nope. Okay, there we go. So we have private property, which encompasses society's forces of production. Like the primary example of private property is land, which can be developed in the interest of generating capital. This versus personal property, the aforementioned toothbrush. These are things meant for individual consumption. Objects within the scope of private property include consumer goods and other basic essentials. But with this demarcation clarified, we're going to move on to the examination of like the nebulous origins to private property. Let's see. All right, yeah. So all humans seek shelter in some form, and in modern American society, shelter is generally manifested as renting or owning property. Despite being the most basic of human needs, many Americans are unable to secure stable access to shelter due to the substantial economic barrier that comes with property rental or ownership. Naturally, rental mandates paying a landlord, whereas ownership requires one purchase of property from a former owner. But shelter is a basic need. So what gives the landlord or former property owner the right to deny it to another person? The landlord or property owner would state that they have a legitimate claim to the property and may do with it as they will, but is their claim to the land truly legitimate? Their ownership of the land was transferred to them by a previous owner and to that previous owner by yet another owner before them. But this chain can't extend forever. How did that which was once the property of no one become the property of an individual? How can the landlord or property owner ascribe legitimacy to their claim? Now, this argument was presented by the political philosopher G.A. Cohen during an interview with UK's Channel 4. It presents a significant problem for advocates of private property ownership. Before private property, the land belonged to all who use it. It's the commons. But then at some point, the public was excluded from the usage of the land. So the question is what occurred that granted legitimacy to that transition? For private ownership of the land and the resources it contains to be salvaged, there has to be some form of justification for property. So how do we justify it? We can't. I mean, you're excluding the populace as a form of theft. So, shout out to Proudhon. So all humans do seek shelter in some, I am skipping back in my paper. It got all funky, it's formatting. Okay, in the most basic terms, property denotes ownership, but the implications that arise from the concept of ownership, as well as the relation between land, labor, and productivity, have garnered investigation from countless philosophers, economists, political theorists. The most rudimentary and oldest explanation of property is known as the first occupancy theory. Simply put, the first to seize the property is the owner. Regardless of the means by which the property was seized, no one has been dispossessed of the land, and thus there are no conflicts of ownership. And despite this common sense appeal to it, the first occupancy theory is pretty inadequate. Any attempts to codify property ownership came well after humanity had spread throughout the globe. So in practice, the application of first occupancy theory took the form of large societies with the means to expand, dismissing the humanity of indigenous peoples and staking claim to their lands. So this is the case for the Americas, Australia, New Zealand. Even when the questionable historical application of the first occupancy theory is dismissed, the theory is still inadequate to resolve the conflicts that arise from the prejudice upon others' interests as the pool of unclaimed land shrinks. If first possession were to be normalized as a standard of ownership, prospective claimants would be incentivized to never invest in any labor upon their land, but rather remain in a frantic sprint to be the first to lay claim to yet more and more land. These problems, paired with the simplicity and inherent shallowness of first occupancy theory, they open a door for other attempts to justify property. Let's see. All right, so arguably the most influential effort in providing justification for private property is the labor theory of property, which was put forth by the Enlightenment era philosopher John Locke in the 1968 work, Two Treatises of Governments. He states in it, "Yet every man has a property in his own person. This nobody has any right to but himself. The labor of his body and the work of his hands, we may say, are properly his. Whatsoever then he removes out of the state that nature hath provided and left it in, he hath mixed his labor with and joined to it something that is his own, and thereby makes it his property. It being by him removed from the common state nature hath placed it in, it hath by this labor something annexed to it, that excludes the common right of other men. So in more modern or layman's terms, Locke's basically saying that labor is this attribute that we're imbuing by or that we as a laborer imbue into the land. And it inherits that attribute in a way that the land is no longer simply representative of the state of nature, but has undergone a change, like in its ontological essence, such that it's resigned from the commons and transforms into this concept of property, of he or they whom labor upon it. To Locke, it's insufficient to be the first to arrive. One must commit to laboring upon the land if their claim to own it is justified. Locke's theory does give a more robust account of the foundations of property, and it does reflect the real world more consistently than representing property as a desperate foot race towards the horizon. After all, if indigenous peoples do not have a cultural concept of property, we can functionally appreciate their right to the land by virtue of their working it. Locke's formulation does end with the property being removed from the common state of nature. This means that the land is exclusively the property of those who labor upon it. And this is the most essential function of private property. Private property does not give one the right to use the land, as it's well established that the right to use the land was universal in the state of nature. Counterintuitively, private property's primary function is to restrict the rights of those who would seek to use the land while not having established ownership. Private property, so often espouses of freedom, is in truth an assault on the rights of those who are not holders of the property, as Marx argues. I think I got a slide for this. Yeah. The right of man to private property is therefore the right to enjoy one's property and to dispose of it at one's discretion. I don't know how to pronounce that French bit there. Without regard to other men, independently of society. The right of self-interest. This individual liberty and its application form the basis of civil society. It makes every man see in other men not the realization of his own freedom, but the barrier to it. But above all, it proclaims the right of man of enjoying and of disposing at his discretion of his goods and income, of the fruits of his labor and industry. This excerpt, it's from On the Jewish Question. It's attacking the French rights of man, which was a document that attempted to employ Locke's work in a practical political application. Marx doesn't pay much mind to the idea of the land being transformed in any way. Instead, he emphasizes that the content of property is to be found not in any change upon the land itself, but in the relationships between man, the land, and the community. The primary social relation of private property is the relation of the owner, relation between the owner of the land and those that are deprived of the land. Marx outlines his relationship-oriented concept of theory in Grundrisse. I don't think I have a slide. Oh, I do have a slide for this one. Look at me go. An isolated individual could no more have property in land and soil than he could speak. He could, of course, live off it as substance, as do the animals. The relation to the earth as property is always mediated through the occupation of land and soil by the tribe, the commune, or some other social formation. In some more or less naturally arisen or already historically developed form, the individual can never appear here in the dot-like isolation in which he appears as mere free worker. If the objective conditions of his labor are presupposed as belonging to him, then he himself is subjectively presupposed as a member of a commune through which his relation to the land and soil is mediated. To further cash out Marx's comparison to speech, consider a world in which there's only one human in existence. What function can language possibly have to that person? Certainly, language only can have a use case if it exists within a community of speakers and listeners. Similarly, the distinction of property is meaningless to the individual. For if there was only one human, what would the point of proclaiming property be? It's reduced to a hollow gesture. The idea of individual property rights contains an internal contradiction. The individual seeks to obtain property which can only exist outside of the individual. But if individual property is internally contradictory in its nature, how then has it enjoyed such practical success? The answer lies in man's distant past and the original mode of production. I'm going to start with a disclaimer real quick. These texts in particular use a lot of dated language. There are some words I'm going to say that I consider somewhat offensive nowadays, and after I say them once, I'm going to clarify an alternative term. But to begin with, pre-Marxist communism, this is another word for primitive communism. Engels discussed this concept of Engels discusses the concept of primitive communism, henceforth referred to as pre-Marxist communism, in the 1884 work, The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State, in which he categorizes the early periods of human existence into two distinctive phases. Savagery, which we're going to henceforth refer to as the wild state, as translated by Christopher Darman Yut, I don't know how to pronounce that name either, and barbarism. The wild state refers to what we would recognize as hunter-gatherer societies, such as the pre-colonial Australian Aborigines. These groups would be migratory. Oh, wait, actually, I do have a slide for this. These groups would be migratory and rely on the natural yields of the land, such as fish and naturally growing produce, while lacking any superstructure that would be recognizable in relation to any concept of civilization or the state. The state of barbarism refers to communities with some degree of superstructure, as well as some horticultural developments and reliance upon livestock. These would be tribal cultures that tend to stick to a fixed relative area. They have advanced enough technology to produce pottery and have an understanding of metallurgy. The ancient Germanic tribes, like the Gauls of the Suevi, would be good examples of the phase of barbarism. Before continuing, it is important to point out that the limited knowledge in the fields of archaeology, anthropology, and evolutionary biology in Engels' time limits the predictive success of his hypothesis. An example is he makes an assumption that like cannibalism is practiced in Australian Aboriginal communities on the basis that without development of archery, they couldn't have provided enough food. Engels would have been constantly bombarded with like colonizer accounts of cannibalism by indigenous groups. Most of these claims are dismissed by modern scholars as manifestations of racist sensationalism. And while Australians didn't independently develop bows, they did develop their own equivalent hunting tools that were suited to the unique conditions of the Australian environment, which he likely would have been unaware of. But in any case, owing to the limitations of the knowledge available in his time, Engels' historical and cultural claims are often unsound, but that alone does not defeat the historical materialist theory of history. As previously mentioned, Engels is speculating on a mode of production that predates the transition to agricultural society, the latter of which would introduce an unequal balance of power between a slave class and a citizen class, as explained by Marx in the German ideology. I don't think I do have a slide. Yeah, we are past the point where my slides are solid and coherent. The second form is the ancient communal and state ownership, which proceeds especially from the union of several tribes into a city by agreement or by conquest, and which is still accompanied by slavery. Beside communal ownership, we already find movable and later also immovable private property developing, but as an abnormal form subordinate to communal ownership. The citizens hold power over their laboring slaves only in their community, and on this account alone, therefore, they are bound to the form of communal ownership. It is the communal private property which compels the active citizens to remain in this spontaneously derived form of association over against their slaves. For this reason, the whole structure of society based on this communal ownership and with it the power of the people decays in the same measure as, in particular, immovable private property evolves. The ancient mode of production is the point at which a complete transition to agriculture has occurred. Communities become fixed in place. Class and subsequently disparity appears, and incentive to amass private property arises as it does yield surplus. The values of the society based upon the ancient mode of production are completely incommensurate with a pre-Marxist communal mode of production. The hunter-gatherer does not need to force the land to yield sustenance. They simply migrate when the land's yields are exhausted. There is no land that their community is fixed upon, so the ownership of the land is useless to them. And any generation of surplus would slow down the movement of the group, thus reducing their migratory range and width at the odds of maintaining a selective advantage in their environment. So then why transition to the ancient mode of production? What sane person would willingly adopt a model that increases their required labor input? Why would the majority acquiesce to a model of development in which they are a lower class? Those who end up at the top of the class hierarchy certainly have proper motivation, but how can they coerce the rest of their community into taking such a bad deal? Engels addresses the oddity that is the transition to an agricultural society in Origins of the State Family. I can't remember the whole thing. I just abbreviated it as Origins by revealing the nature of the state and its coercive power. The state is, therefore, by no means a power forced on society from without, just as little as it is Just as little is it the reality of the ethical idea, the image and reality of reason, as Hegel maintains. Rather, it is a product of society at a certain stage of development. It is the admission that this society has become entangled in insoluble contradiction with itself, that it has split into irreconcilable antagonisms, which it is powerless to dispel. But in order that these antagonisms, these classes with conflicting economic interests, might not consume themselves in society in fruitless struggle, it became necessary to have a power seemingly standing above society that would alleviate the conflict and keep it within the bounds of order. And this power, arisen out of society, but placing itself above it and alienating itself more and more from it, is the state. The conflicts that arise from the class disparity are a threat that destabilizes society built upon the ancient mode of production. But the erection of the state apparatus subdues those conflicts and maintains order, that the citizens may retain their status and continued oppression of the slave class. Engels goes on to explain that it is by force, by armed men and institutions of coercion, that the state maintains its power. And through the state apparatus is born internal forces, is and though the state apparatus is born of internal forces to the community upon which it enacts its programs of alienation, its influence is not resigned to the internal. For it is with agriculture and the accrual of surplus that endeavors such as warfare become exponentially more viable. And once warfare is viable, an existential threat is born to any for whom warfare is not viable. Okay. So agriculture has multiple independent points of origin, but the Fertile Crescent is of particular note due to not only to the abundance of viable crops that were cultivated in the region, but also because those crops were cultivated by societies that were among the earliest to demonstrably display a concept of private property. The Sumerian civilization left cuneiform records that display a high preoccupation with issues of land usage, allocation, ownership, and inheritance. The Egyptian Old Kingdom, likewise, most of their documents were dealt with property. The Assyrians solely used the written language for property. There was no art or literature, nothing with words, but the ascribing of property rights. All of these civilizations to rise in the Fertile Crescent share this attribute, and the idea of private property spread to the young nations upon the borders of those first civilizations, and then appeared yet again on the borders of those adopters. The spread of private property was a defensive reaction. Any culture that observed an agricultural power on their border with a mode of production that could utilize private property to increase yield at the cost of alienation and class disparity would have to choose between emulating that mode of production or resigning themselves to be conquered as the slave class of that neighbor. The only cultures that avoided such a fate were those who were geographically isolated from the Fertile Crescent, such as the Australian Aboriginals, the various cultures of the Americas, and the Polynesian cultures, among others. So the concept of private property exists in the name of social utility, devoid of any foundation of logical merit. Legalistic defenses of legitimate acquisition ultimately collapse when the origin of land acquisition is traced to some act of theft. Attempts to define private property as some form of rights are also inadequate, as they rely upon ascribing to the individual an attribute that only exists in the individual's relation to their community. Among the most common arguments espoused by the capitalist class, desperately attempting to salvage this beloved concept of private property, is an appeal to human nature. And yet, for the vast majority of human existence, there has been no conception of private property. With no foundation of legitimacy to stand upon, private property has survived only by force. Just as in its historical foundation, it manifests today as imperialism and orchestrates genocide, ecological ruin, and alienation. Throughout human history, this bedrock to exploitation and the rise of capitalism has worn many masks. But while that mask constantly changes, it's always been consistent in its method of spread, for it does so at the end of a sword. Thanks, guys.